Welcome to Part 7, where I will summarize Parts 1 through 6 and discuss their implications. Here's our completed outline. In Part 1, we determined that the statement, "faith contradicts science," has many possible interpretations. The first of these interpretations was addressed in Part 2, and is that faith contradicts the method of science. In other words, the scientific method only deals with what can be tested, but faith does not. And since faith can't be tested, we have no way of knowing if they are true. This objection is fallacious in two ways. Firstly, it strawmans the Christian faith, which almost always presents evidence for its beliefs. It does this by committing the second fallacy, which is judging the entire Christian faith based on the beliefs of a few of its more intellectually lazy adherents. The second problem is that it is non-falsifiable. It demands that the Christian prove their claims scientifically, which is no more possible than it is to chop down a tree with a fish. Both tools are inadequate. As it is, the objector gives the Christian an inadequate tool, which makes disproving the objector's belief impossible. Thirdly, the objection is self-defeating. Firstly, because the objector's belief that the scientific method is the only way to determine truth is a position of faith, but also because the very use of the scientific method is an act of faith. One cannot drive out faith with a scientific method that relies on faith to function. If they are successful, then they have reintroduced faith, not abolished it. As it is, using the scientific method is a prime example of the Bible's epistemology, which is that evidence can indeed point us to faith. In Part 3, I address the second objection, which is that faith contradicts the scope of science. In other words, there is no room for faith-based explanations because science explains everything there is. I gave 6 answers to this. Firstly, this objection is fallacious in 2 ways. Fallacy number 1 is that it assumes that faith and science are incompatible, that where one exists, the other cannot. This leads to the second fallacy, which is that the objection strawmans the Christian faith. It acts as if the Christian must choose between faith and science, when that is not the case. As it is, belief that faith and science are incompatible is a belief of epistemology, not science, and is therefore a position of faith. Therefore, this objection defeats itself, for it reintroduces what it tries to drive out. The objection makes another statement of faith, which is that science explains everything there is. Whether the objector believes that is currently the case or that the scientific explanations are on their way, either position is one of faith. So, there are 2 statements of faith embedded in this objection, meaning that it defeats itself in 2 ways. The third problem is that the naturalistic worldview is vastly incomplete. It cannot explain things like emotions, beauty, or self-awareness, or any of the positions of faith mentioned in Part 2. Not that we needed to address the idea that science explains everything. As stated, science and faith can coexist, but we addressed it anyway, for argument's sake. Because the objector exercises these positions of faith all the time, the objection is also hypocritical, which is the fourth problem. Now, if the objector tries to resuscitate their argument by saying, well, the scientific explanations are on their way, but we don't have them yet, they vastly overestimate the capabilities of science, which creates more questions than it answers. It also performs a massive extrapolation into space and into time, which is not scientific at all. I italicize these last 2 problems because the objector won't necessarily bring this up. However, it is fairly likely that they will. In Part 4, I address the idea that faith contradicts the findings of science. So, for example, the biblical account of creation contradicts macroevolution. This I did not directly answer, but instead referred this objection to other apologetical resources. And this was because these questions have been largely answered, and because answering them fell outside the scope of this video series. In Part 5, I address the idea that faith contradicts scientists. So apparently most scientists do not practice faith, and since they are so good at science, we should do the same. I gave 3 answers to this. Firstly, it is self-defeating because one must only go back in history to see a time when most scientists were people of faith. So by the objector's logic, at the time of these scientists, it would have been right to have faith, which makes their present denial of faith false. Secondly, the objection is fallacious, because just because a scientist says something does not make it true, especially when it comes to faith. And even in the realm of science, scientists are not always correct, as history has demonstrated. Thirdly, the studies that are often used to support this objection tend to be biased, for which I gave up to 4 sources. So, objection 4 is self-defeating, fallacious, and tends to be biased. In part 6, I addressed the idea that miracles contradict science. So it is not faith in particular, but the miracles that are so commonly associated with faith that contradict science. I broke this up into 3 possible objections, but before I got into those, I said that any attempt from science to rule out miracles is statistically unlikely due to the sheer number of miracle accounts. It only takes one of them to be true for naturalism to be false. The first objection states that miracles cannot happen because they are violations of the laws of nature. I gave 4 answers to this. This makes at least 4 unjustified assumptions. They are that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, that such violations do not happen, that such violations cannot happen, and that the laws of nature explain everything there is. The second objection was that miracles are, by definition, unlikely events. This has 3 problems. Firstly, it is non-falsifiable, for there is no way to prove this position false, even if it were false. Secondly, it assumes that uncommon events are unlikely, which runs into the problem of induction. This is especially a problem when you are dealing with the supernatural. Thirdly, not all proposed miracles are uncommon. The third objection is that extraordinary claims like miracles require extraordinary amounts of evidence. This is a variation of the second objection and therefore inherits 2 of its problems. That is, it assumes that an extraordinary event is unlikely, which is unsafe, especially given that it deals with the supernatural. It also assumes that miracles are extraordinary, which is not always the case. Problems that are unique to the third objection include, firstly, that all claims require the same amount of evidence. To say otherwise is biased. Secondly, the objection is an extraordinary claim and therefore demands an extraordinary amount of evidence that is rarely, if ever, given. Thirdly, by its own logic, it rules out extraordinary events, which makes it unfriendly to scientific discoveries. As it is, most of the objections to miracles from science are not scientific at all, but rather are philosophical statements disguised as scientific statements, being used by people who want a way to rule out miracles in advance so that they don't have to consider the evidence. So the thesis statement, which is that religious faith does not contradict science, has been defended philosophically. Remember, the evidential arguments are for elsewhere. Most of my arguments were defensive in nature, so they protected faith against objections. However, 7 of those arguments were also offensive in nature, showing the necessity for faith. I have bolded those 7. They are that the scientific method is built on faith from part 2, and my 6 answers to the second objection. So faith must exist, both by its lack of conflict with science and by necessity. You might notice that all 4 of the objections that were answered were in some way self-defeating. This is a common characteristic of arguments that target the Christian faith. Also, 2 of them were hypocritical. So when you're in a debate, always look for 2 things. Does the objector's argument follow their own logic, and do their actions follow their own logic? Most often, the answer is no for both questions. So what are the implications of this? Firstly, it means that religious faith and science do not conflict philosophically. I say philosophically because many of the so-called arguments against faith from science are actually philosophical in nature, disguised in the language of science. I hope you saw this theme. So if faith and science do not philosophically conflict, then one does not have to compromise their intellectual integrity to have religious faith. The second implication stems from the first, and is that it is those who object to religious faith, at least those who object in the ways mentioned, that have the blind faith. Why is this? Well, faith is required because science cannot test most of their objections. Most of them are statements of faith, not science. And this faith must be blind because virtually all of their objections to faith have logical faults. So to believe them, even in the face of conflicting evidence and when your own worldview does not allow for faith, is an act of blind faith. That is, it lacks the basis that Christians have for their faith. Therefore, the naturalistic worldview is not what it appears to be. On the outside, it appears very logical and open-minded, but really operates on blind faith. The third implication stems from the second, and concerns the motives behind the naturalistic worldview. The fact that their objections to faith have so many logical faults, and that their worldview operates on blind faith, should suggest that the motives behind it are not logical or scientific. As it is, the motive is often a strong bias against the supernatural, and has little to do with science. So the objector will say, "Show me evidence for your belief, and I will believe." And that seems open-minded on the outside, but the catch is that if they are biased, and they very often are, they will never accept something as being evidence. Just like the Richard Dawkins quote in the beginning with the statue of the Virgin Mary. That is, they will always find ways to explain the evidence away, so that they never have to accept something they don't want to accept. In a debate, this is important to know because the Bible has a lot to say about motives and being intellectually honest. So knowing this can add power to your conversation. And as always, remember to target the worldview, not its adherents. So our conclusion is what scientists for many centuries concluded, and was only recently rejected, which is that sound reasoning points us toward faith, not away from it. That is all. Thank you for watching.